It's difficult to find the perfect gift for a badminton player if you're not playing the sport yourself, because there's so many obvious gear items where small specifications makes all the difference. And so if that player hasn't specified a certain detail or we accidentally get it wrong, the player will have a totally different experience on court. That could be the weight class of the racket or the sizing of the shoe. In this video, I'll give you examples of badminton gifts based on 4 different budgets. Less than $200, less than $100, less than $50, and finally smaller items as badminton gifts for less than $25. Obviously, gear costs a different amount in different countries, so take this with a grain of salt. And finally, if you're interested in specific examples that are updated, go check out the written article of this guide, since it's much easier for me to update that whenever companies make new products. I'll leave a link in the description. I'm Aske from Beast Badminton, and first, let's look at 3 gifts you should avoid for badminton players. There are 3 gifts that are just much harder than most other ones to gift accurately to a badminton player. So let's go over those and the things to be aware of if you choose to gift these items. And the first one is badminton shoes. Obviously, the sizing is difficult to get right, especially because there's basically 3 sort of bigger badminton brands that most players are familiar with, and their sizing is different. So for us players, we tend to have to measure our foot in millimeters or centimeters and then convert that into the individual size of each of these brands. And then on top of that, there's a huge difference in preference for the player depending on their body frame, how big of a body they have, if they want more cushion or lower weight or something in the middle, and if they prefer some more injury preventive features or more cushioning and comfort. And for me, one of the most important things, the fit in terms of like how narrow or wide your feet are. This stuff is super difficult to get right, even for badminton players. And so in order to get this right, you really have to know a very specific model of shoe, the color scheme that the player likes, and the size. If you don't have all that information, I would skip over the shoes and move on to something else. Another gift that might seem obvious is the racket. And especially if we just want to give them the best of the best, and we make the mistake that I made by going on price and just picking whatever is the most expensive, assuming that it will be the best product. But I realized that the skill level and the price specifically of badminton rackets tend to follow each other. So the more expensive the racket, the better your skills need to be in order for the player to take full advantage of the racket. Now there are also specific configurations and specific rackets based on the playing style of the player. So do they want more power, more speed, a blend all around? Do they want a heavier or a lighter racket? Do they want a grip size that's bigger or smaller? And of course, not to mention the color scheme. So what you're gonna need in order to get this right is you're gonna need the name. And I can give a few examples here on the screen. This one, for example, is the Yonex Arc Saber 11 Play in the 4U weight category and with the G5 grip size. So you're gonna need to know the weight class, which is usually 3U or 4U, and the grip size, which is usually G5 or G6. In some cases can be G4. And you're gonna need the names, which might be Yonex, which is the brand, the series, which is the Arc Saber, and then the model, which is the 11, and then the ability or the skill level and the budget, the pricing, which is Play in this case, which is for beginner and intermediate players. So there's a lot of small details that the player needs to write on their wish list in order to make sure that you're getting the right product. If you don't have all these details, I would skip over buying rackets as well and going for something else on this list. Finally, I found that paying for badminton classes or coaching hours on behalf of someone else can be pretty tricky as well, unless it's specifically on their wish list. First of all, because a lot of badminton players are just not really that interested in getting better. Sure, they might say that they are, but if they're not trying to find coaches or actively figure out a way to work on their skills, it might just be that they enjoy playing it recreationally and doesn't really care about improving their skill set. Another thing is the communication with the coach and doing group classes versus individual classes versus having to transport yourself at a certain hours whereas works for that coach and going there and coming back. It's a lot to sign up for someone else if you're not super confident that they're looking for this. So the 3 big items to avoid is badminton shoes, badminton rackets, and training or coaching classes, unless they have very specifically specified all the details that I mentioned. Next, let's look at badminton gifts that might be better, starting with the $200 budget. The tricky thing here with the tech items is that there's so many variations. There's usually a top tier one and a budget option and a million options in between, plus the pricing tend to fluctuate quite a bit between countries. So take this as a reference point rather than the specific item I'm using to illustrate being the perfect item for the player that you're trying to find a gift for. First, let's look at a massage gun. I got one of these gifted for my birthday. I wasn't really familiar with these at first, but basically they're used to massaging a part of your body, let's say your thighs or your calves, if you're sore after playing badminton. They come in many different shapes, sizes, and budget, but usually the core thing here is that they have a few different mounts you can put on depending on what you're trying to massage, and they should all function in a very similar way where you just turn it on and put it on the area that you wish to massage. Another item in this category of less than $200 is a fitness smartwatch for the players that are interested in tracking how many calories they burn while they're playing badminton or some other sport or being at the gym. Next, let's cover badminton gift ideas if your budget is $100 or less. Another option that tends to be slightly more affordable than a smartwatch is a heart rate monitor. And as the name suggests, it's meant to monitor your heart rate while you're playing badminton, which can be useful if you're interested in improving your skills and especially your stamina. Another item for less than $100 is a badminton bag. And I have a few examples here. This is your classic backpack from a random brand. And this is one of your bigger badminton bags. I think this one is called the Yonex tournament bag. It's not that one bag is better than the other, but it depends on the player's preference. So I have found that when I'm testing badminton shoes, the bigger tournament bag is more useful for me because I can just carry more stuff. The trade-off is that it doesn't have strap for me to wear it over my shoulder or as a backpack of sorts, so I have to carry it by hand or attempt to wear these around my shoulders, which gets really awkward since they're not really suited for that. On the other hand, we have a classic backpack, which is much more convenient if you're using a bicycle, a scooter, or another two-wheeler to get to and from the courts, since you can just wear it on your back. The downside is that it doesn't fit the badminton rackets entirely, so they'll be sticking out, which means that if it's raining, they're less protected. It can be hard to figure out which badminton bag to gift to your player. So The way I would look at it is simple. Look at what they're already using as their bag and give them an upgrade of the same type. So if they're already using a backpack, I would give them another backpack, maybe one that's nicer, or maybe a newer one if the one they have is super old and broken. If they're using a plastic bag or something and you want to give them like one of the badminton specific options, I would consider how much gear they have, usually how many rackets they bring on court. Often if they bring more than 2 or 3 rackets on court, I would get the bigger bag. Of course, if they're bringing 2 pairs of shoes, I would also get the bigger bag, since a typical smaller backpack really just carries 1 pair of shoes along with all the other stuff. If they're just using a couple of rackets, 1 pair of shoes, and you know that they're driving on bicycle or scooter to the courts, a backpack might be a better fit. Next, let's look at badminton gifts for $50 or less. And so the first one, and perhaps the most obvious one that many of us think of, is shuttles. Now they come in tubes of 12 if it's feather ones usually, and they cost from $10 up until like $50 and above, depending on the quality that you're looking for. And so there's usually a few different sort of levels or price ranges. The top tier one being tournament grade shuttles, which are nice, but for most players that are just playing recreationally or training, it's a total overkill and they're far too nice. If you want to give shuttles and you want to give some nice ones, but not the tournament grade ones, I would look at what the tournament or the most expensive ones cost where you live, and then go for roughly half the price or 2/3 of the price of that. So you get something mid-range, but not so nice that the player will never use it because they're just too high quality and they want to save them for a special occasion. Another thing to consider is whether the player you're looking for a gift for is playing with feather shuttles like these or plastic shuttles. And so most players that are playing indoors and are playing seriously, or taking it seriously at least, prefer feather shuttles because they have less speed, they have more feel and more control. It's a totally different experience to play with the plastic ones, but the huge benefit of the plastic ones is the durability. They'll last forever. It's important to figure out whether your player prefers plastic shuttles, which are usually used outdoors as well, or feather shuttles. And then the second important item is the speed, since there are different speeds of shuttles. Usually the packages will say right on, either they'll say slow, medium or fast, or they'll usually have a number, something like 75, 76, 77 or 78, where the higher the number, the faster the shuttle, but it depends on the climate you're playing in. So there is a big difference in terms of feel when you're on court playing with them. If you're playing with a slow one and then you switch to a fast one, it feels quite different and your shots will feel very different. So I suggest figuring out what the player is already playing with in terms of speed and then get a similar speed. Usually, as a very simple rule of thumb, if you're playing in the west or in colder weather, you tend to go for a higher speed. And if you're playing in hot and humid weather, you might use a slower speed. Next, we have t-shirts and shorts, which could both be off-court t-shirts like these that you would wear when you're not playing, or it could be on-court t-shirts. And if you're looking for on-court t-shirt and shorts, remember that for players, they tend to prefer that they are 100% made of polyester, because the sweat will be transported away from the body slightly rather than the material keeping onto it, like we tend to feel with cotton, which makes the t-shirts heavier, more wet and sweatier. And usually many players, especially if they're playing somewhere where it's super hot, they'll bring more than one t-shirt. I'll bring, for example, 2 or 3 t-shirts on court and switch between them during a 2-hour session. Another option that, granted I haven't tested and I haven't even tried myself yet, is a foam roller. I've heard these can be great if you're stretching or you have an issue with a muscle somewhere. But the tricky part is that a lot of badminton players don't like warming up and stretching. And so if the player you're trying to find a gift for isn't one of those people that like stretching, they'll probably not enjoy having a foam roller. So it'll be useful for you to figure out whether they prefer stretching before deciding on whether to give them a foam roller. Another useful gift for less than $50 can be a towel, especially for drying off sweat between games or sometimes between rallies while you're on court, because your hands, your palms and your face tend to get super sweaty, and it can be difficult to hold on to the rackets properly if your hands are too sweaty. Now, the important detail is that it shouldn't be too small so that the surface area will be wet too quickly, and it shouldn't be too big that it'll be inconvenient to carry around, especially if your player is using a backpack without that much space. Finally, let's look at ideas for badminton gifts for less than $25. One option is a small pair of scissors, which is used to cut the strings if you break the string while you're playing. If the player doesn't cut their strings right after the string breaks, it can deform the frame of the racket and then you'll have to go buy a new racket. So it's handy to have a small pair of scissors just to cut the strings real quick. Another gift could be resistance bands or TheraBands, which are also used for warming up and stretching. And once again, if you know that this player is not into warming up and stretching, I would probably skip this idea as well. Next, another option is a hand grip strengthening device. And these come in many different shapes and they tend to come in different strengths. And so I would just get one that's somewhere in the middle, unless you know that the player prefer a very light one because their hands might be weak, or they prefer a very heavy one. Some other type of hand grip strengtheners come with multiple weights that you can adjust. So you can start with a low weight and then work your way up. And this can be useful for squeezing the racket to generate power. Another option are these hex balls that, granted, I haven't tested myself, but I saw them online and thought it was a great idea because some players like to play at home up against the wall. And so if you're playing with a shuttlecock against the wall, it'll damage the wall most likely, and it's an annoying sound. And so these hex balls can be very useful as they're designed to not get you in trouble by damaging the walls. Another option that's nice to have is a standard sports deodorant, since all the clothes we're bringing is gonna stink of sweat. And so it's just nice to have an extra deodorant that you can keep in the badminton bag at all times, and you don't have to remember to take it from the bathroom and bring it and put it back and forth. Another option can be new grips for the handle of the player's racket. And there are two main categories. There's the towel grip, which is basically towel or cotton for people that sweat a lot in their palms. This is the one that I prefer, and you'll see I have one on here from Yonex, and it looks very much like a towel. Another option is this PU overgrip, which tend to be used for people that doesn't sweat as much. And both are applied onto the racket, and I usually change mine once a month. So you're just gonna go through a bunch as you're playing. And so you can get them in single packs like these, or you can get them in bigger rolls. And I guess for many players, if they're like me, switching it out once a month or so, that would last like a year or something per racket. But this is something that makes a meaningful difference, at least in my game. If I forget to change it, it's much harder to switch between different grips while I'm playing, and I do notice that my game becomes worse as a result until I switch it and get one that's easier to hold on to while you're moving fast and sweating on court. Finally, we've made it to the last item on the list in the $25 category. And that is badminton grip powder. This is essentially just chalk that you use if you're doing climbing training or bouldering training to take some of the sweat away from your palms. But it only works with towel grips. So if your player is not using a towel grip, or if you're wanting to give them a PU over grip, it doesn't make sense to combine with the grip powder. When you're selecting which grip to get them, again, I would go for what they already like and get some of those, since the feeling is quite different. And especially if you have smaller hands, the towel grip can feel a little bit too big for some players. I hope these badminton gift ideas gave you some inspiration. Next, I suggest checking out the written guide that follows this video, where I'll have specific product recommendations for each category. I'll leave a link in the description. And if you're a badminton player looking for ideas for your wish list, go check out the blog as well. I do a bunch of badminton shoe tests and other gear. I'm Asker from Beast Badminton, and I'll see you on court.